monkey, a comet crashing into some jungle. Rendition of Michelangelo's except touching the monkey hand, and then a businessman being like used as a puppet with alien hands pulling the strings. This back in like 2003 or so. So I was like crashing when I was going my oh my god, conspiracies are real. And we all kind of like when the big narratives that were fed as we're born into this world try to map it out, when the big narratives turn out to be fraudulent, it gets messy for a lot of people. And there's a lot of traps along the way to suck people in out of the big net, who jump out of the big net and fall into smaller nets that seem like they embrace a greater spectrum of reality, except there's some Trojan horses along the way. And we have no shortage right now of secondary, tertiary, small nets masquerading as truth for those who want to think in alternative modalities and not the big popular. I was eating it all up, and over the course as the years go by, you're like becoming more geopolitically savvy about some of the intelligence agencies and their methodologies in terms of controlling the minds or creating a space of illusory truths for the minds to be to jump into as little subcages. Months, Heather and I, Dr. Heather Lynn and I have found ourselves in the same sort of space in certain think tank, as Kurt Metzger calls it, it's a little unofficial think tank, and just sharing ideas about how psyops work. And I was very impressed by Heather's work. Heather, for those who don't know, is an author historian. As she codifies herself as a renegade archaeologist, tracing the hidden architecture beneath the modern world. She's an adjunct professor of humanities. Her H files, I subscribe to it on Substack, is a fantastic resource. Really, really sharp ideas. And the Midnight Academy podcast is a fun thing too, as well, for people who like outside the box thinking. And she's written a lot of books. A lot of them are going to be in the description box under this video. But Heather, we were just chatting a little bit about the fraud of what the hand stories that are being pummeled, especially now that it seems like everybody in government, in every institution, is really adamant that human beings at this point in time right now should be thinking a lot about UFO disclosure and government collusion with ETs. That's like everywhere we look. So you've painted an interesting picture, especially as far as the frauds of the ancient archaeology stuff is concerned with the ET spins. So I was really happy some of your thoughts, your ideas, and like we'll usually, like we always do, after Dr. Lynn goes through her formal remarks, we'll open up for some Q&A with the live audience. So everybody just put either your digital hand up or put your name in the chat box, and I'll call upon you so you can throw a question or a thought at Heather as you see fit. Dr. Lynn, it is all yours.
Well, thank you so much for having me here. It's a great pleasure and honor because I just love your work so much. And we've been spending a lot of time in our informal think tank sharing back and forths. And it's not every day that you find people who are so awakened. I hate to use the word woke and all of that, but just that metaphor I think has been played out. But there is something to it because there are people who are just sort of sleepwalking us into Armageddon. It just seems as though. And I think, strangely enough, the ancient alien question, it has a lot more to do with it than one would initially think. It seems probably more entertaining than anything else to most people, especially with television shows like Ancient Aliens. And, for full disclosure, I've been on the show, and I usually am an apologist for the show for this reason. My experience has been that they never tell you what to say. They have a huge variety of people. They like to try to showcase people who are these so-called ancient astronaut theorists. Those are the ones with the quite the entertaining hair choices or the personalities than they do the people who might add some level of credibility or something to that effect. But they've never edited me in ways that I felt were objectionable, and it's usually the same core group of individuals who, from what I can from what I can tell, don't really have anything nefarious going on, although you never know when you get up to the top. But so that's just my take on that. I think at least initially I thought it was a good thing that those types of shows existed, because I felt like, and I kind of still want to think that those shows and maybe books and things that are more entertaining like that stoke creativity and get people thinking out of the box. And I don't think it's very harmful, but I think something's happened over the past 20, like accelerated those. So maybe the past 15 years, definitely the past 7 years, there's been something different now. It's moved out of the realm of just a curious late night entertainment and into something that says pure propaganda all over it. Something that now when we're looking around, the term, say, Anunnaki has become more familiar with people, whereas in the past it hadn't been at all. When I would be teaching, say, an intro to humanities course and going over all of the ancient peoples, I would ask, how many have heard of the Sumerians? And yes, some. How many have heard of ancient Egypt? Of course, most people. But over the years, I saw it change where many of the students were familiar with the Sumerians and primarily their gods, the Anunnaki. But unfortunately, what they were familiar with was this very specific version of the story, which was very much a science fiction story, and that can be attributed to Zecharia Sitchin, who we'll get into a little more. But just to sort of, I guess, explain why I even look into these topics. Initially, I'm a cognitive archaeologist, and so I look at cultural resources and the past to try to see if we can piece together how people thought. So a little different than intellectual history or that, because it's difficult to try to figure out the brain structures, but sort of looking at maybe textual evidence. I deal with authors like Julian Jaynes and people like that. So just a background, I start going into archaeology in this regard. Of course, it opens it up to some strange topics, and people have a lot to fill in those gaps, because history is a story, right? There's these historical data points, but the rest of it has to be filled in by a story. And that leaves a lot of problems and a potential vacuum, of course. So I'm writing a blog, and it starts to become a little popular, and I cover a story about excavations that were going on in Iraq for the first time in decades because of war. This was the first time, in particular, Western academics had been there. So it was the University of Manchester was heading this whole thing, so it appeared. And it looked really interesting. And so I reached out to the professor and said, "Yeah, can you tell me a little more about what's going on? And in fact, could I have an interview with you or ask some questions?" And he says, "Sure. Just run it through my secretary and we'll figure that out." So I had like 5 questions. I put it out to the members of my blog. And funny enough, everybody's question had to do with Anunnaki, and more specifically, the concept of stargates. And so I thought, well, this is what the people want, so I'm going to put that in there. And of course, I was ghosted at that point, which made me think, okay, I get it. Maybe that was a little too much, but I felt that I had sort of framed it tastefully and respectfully, but it was a little too much. So then I got to thinking, well, who's funding this after all? Where did the rest of this go? Because it was a single press release, and it really didn't expand upon all of the different things that were found. And so after investigating, I saw that the entire thing was funded by big oil, particularly a company called Gulf Sands Petroleum that had ties to the Bush family dynasty. And then banking families, of course, Price Waterhouse Coopers, some just different organizations dealing with finance. And then one name in particular was Baron von Thyssen of the Thyssen family dynasty. And what made him notable, other than the fact that his family had been wrapped up in funding the Nazi war machine from the very beginning, he was the second largest collector of antiquities, specifically Mesopotamian antiquities, since second only to Queen Elizabeth II. So it was unclear how much he actually had. Likewise, it was unclear how much the Queen had, but they were sort of neck and neck on that. And I thought, well, that seems like a conflict of interest on all different angles. But I started looking a little further into it and found that the field reports were actually not being distributed through the university system. They were first being distributed in closed door boardrooms at Gulf Sands Petroleum. And so I thought, okay, that's a little peculiar as well. So I keep pushing and pushing. And then I publish this. I publish it in a little report. And I just kind of say, I'm going to be investigating this as far as I can. And then individuals reached out to me with a lot of different concerns, people on the ground, and then people who were, as I found out later, self-described occultists. And I thought, well, that's very strange. And so I followed those leads and pulled on those threads for about 13 years. And that's how I started going from just looking into some of the strange, anomalous ideas of the past, looking into different religious beliefs. And I was a economic historian. And so between economic history and cognitive archaeology, somehow then I got pulled into the question of the Anunnaki, whether or not they're aliens, whether or not they're something else. And then finding out that there was a huge interest in this, not just in a popular cultural sense, but also in a geopolitical and occult sense, and which was shocking. So sometimes people will see the books that I have out and it'll start with something like the Anunnaki Connection. And then you'll see that I have a book on Baphomet. It's like, where does this like intersect? But it most certainly does. So that's what I spent a lot of time working on. So if you look back to the idea of what I would say a legitimate question of paleo contact, as it's called, versus what the media likes to push as specifically ancient astronauts, because that paints a very specific picture of sort of a 1960s astronaut or cosmonaut, this kind of nuts and bolts machinery. And that really has to do with the work of von Daniken, but then Zecharia Sitchin as well. So if anyone's heard of Zecharia Sitchin, I think this is really where specifically the Anunnaki story starts to coalesce into something that becomes almost a modern mythos. And now what you have when people do discuss the possibility that perhaps at some point in time, the Earth was visited by some sort of extraterrestrial entity or entities, it becomes now very much limited to Sitchin's contribution, which was essentially a costume and a counterfeit philology. He said that the Anunnaki came from a literal planet called Nibiru that was on a 3,600 year orbit, and that every almost 500,000 years, they come to mine gold. He says the humans were engineered as a slave species, done so by splicing their genes into early hominids. And then, of course, the Anunnaki story gets folded into the Nephilim of Genesis, and the human kinship is read more of a sort of office setup. So it's like this Starfleet command center, sky god kind of thing. And it has a very, as I said, science fiction component to it. And the academic rejection of it is not necessarily political or anything. It's purely technical. One of the bigger minds that used to go after him was a gentleman named Dr. Michael Heiser, who was a legitimate Assyriologist, and he had a website called sitchiniswrong.com. But part of what then created, I say, this like cult of personality thing was everybody really loved the work that Sitchin did for so long because it was very popular and fun. And some of it was even actually fiction. So a lot of people kind of lump the nonfiction and the fiction together under the guise of, well, it was so dangerous to the narrative that of course it has to be under fiction, right? So we have that. But the initial book that set this all off was in 1976. It's called The 12th Planet. And so in this sense, you have him dominating and shaping a very specific narrative. He claimed to have been like the only person that could actually read these Sumerian texts, which is just not true at all. The field had been going just fine for a long time before he came along. But it was, again, this lone academic kind of mythos he was surrounding himself in. And then, of course, you have Michael Heiser, who didn't necessarily portray his own bias, which was that he was an evangelical and had that perspective. And so while he was a legitimate scholar and really was able to take Sitchin to task, he would sometimes go in and put things in that were so-called Bible-based. And so at that point, you're now trapped in a paradigm of it's either a science fiction story or a quote Judeo-Christian narrative. And that's where we're sort of at to this day with that. Now, Sitchin has passed away, and a lot of people still hold him up as this now legend, and that he was the only person who knew anything about the Anunnaki. But the question then really is, why this particular set of gods? Why did they capture the imagination so much? So I think you'd have to kind of go back a little bit and look at two separate things. One, the advent of archaeology as a whole. It's looked at as a science, of course, currently. It's also looked at as much as many people in at least the American Anthropological Association would not want it to be known or talked about. It's a soft science. And there's nothing really inherently wrong with that, but that is what it is. And no amount of scientific technology or tools or LiDAR scans or ground penetrating radar is going to change the fact that when you find something in situ, you have to still be able to infer or use a qualitative analysis to understand perhaps what could have been the reason for it being there, or what job it did, or what context it had within the larger cultural question. So that's something that in the early years of archaeology was kind of put in by design. So it started out as a very wealthy person's hobby of the landed gentry in Europe in particular. And it was basically called antiquarianism. And this would be, people have some money and they have the ability to travel, and they would go to these far off places and essentially loot and bring the things back to their cabinet of curiosities, which would be not necessarily a small cabinet, but rather a whole room where they would display these things like a museum. And I think probably one of the most famous examples, or most fun, would be the Highclere Castle, which is the set for the popular films and masterpiece theater show Downton Abbey. So if you're familiar with Downton Abbey, you'll know that the original lord of that manor was the one who actually funded the expedition to acquire everything from King Tut's tomb. And he acquired everything from King Tut, brought it back to Downton Abbey, or Highclere Castle. And in that basement was everything that eventually ended up in a museum, although they still do have a collection. That's where, when you hear of the stories of the mummy's curse or people dying, getting sick and that sort of thing, that was happening at Highclere Castle. So very kind of romantic idea of things, but it's something to consider. And I think that show is probably a really good, maybe layperson entryway into this question, because it's set during a time where there's great sociocultural upheaval. You have the war, the First World War, and people start to change their mindsets about who has all this land, who has all this privilege and this sort of thing. And a lot of things were just changing. Well, in response to that, these individuals who are antiquarians did not want to give up their passion, their hobby. And it was a little more than a hobby too, because it really had a lot to do with trying to find any evidence of, well, bloodlines, of course, divine right to rule. There was a lot of Freemasonic mythos that could have come out of that. There was a lot of interest in it, where it was more than just a simple curiosity. It was taken very seriously. So they wanted to protect it. And so they ended up donating a lot of the findings to museums and universities and the so-called public trust. And even to this day in museums, you'll see little plaques and labels beside pieces that will say generously donated by this family or that family. But it was a way to sort of like beat it before it got to them. They legitimized it then into a science and worked with universities and libraries and research institutions and started using more scientific methodology and making it a little bit more public. And so it's not a very old discipline. We're talking the 19th century. And so it's just usually, I find it's very important to point that out, because so many people now you'll hear in sort of debates and things online talking about what we quote know about the past based on the evidence. And you should always just look at that with a little bit of healthy skepticism and have the asterisks aside. So in other words, if we say history begins at Sumer, we can literally say that because the beginning of history starts with the written record. That's the story. Before anything written down, it would have been considered prehistory. So history begins in Sumer, which is in Mesopotamia, which is modern day Iraq, and in between the land of the Tigris and the Euphrates. So with that said, though, you still would want to put an asterisk on that, because there are other sites like Göbekli Tepe that have been found, and it's going to take many decades, if not more, to fully excavate it. And you never know. You could actually find evidence of some sort of written record, and then that would push the timeline back. So the problem often comes when people have a very steadfast view of what the past is. And most of that has to do with people wanting to shape the narrative or hold on to the narrative in particular countries as well. So you'll see that a lot in the United States, in particular where I am, and that is by organizations like the American Anthropological Association. But it's not like that everywhere, but there's a lot of this compartmentalization as well. So with that said, that's one problem that you have, is the idea that archaeology itself is more of a mixed methodology, and there's a lot of room for interpretation. And you can see how much power it could grant somebody. It could grant them the ability to not just shape the story as like a historian would, but also have physical, tangible evidence to sort of say, hey, but look, we found this. And so it's a step up almost in legitimizing it because of the mixed methodology approach to it. But then you have in this 19th century, when things are sort of coming together and all of these individuals are just going out looking for things, you find, again with Sumer, finding this language, finding this culture and this civilization. And it was unlike anything anybody had ever seen before. So much so that in academia, they called it the, quote, Sumerian problem. And there was a real scholarly war over this, and it ran for decades. The Sumerian problem is kind of a technical question. It was who invented the first writing system. But later in the 19th century, language, race, and culture were treated sort of as a one substance. So the question everyone was really asking underneath that was, which race invented civilization? But the initial question was sort of twofold. The Sumerian problem does have to do with the language problem, but also this civilization problem, which is, how is it that in the course of only 200 years, after millennia of gatherers, and then boom, in almost a historic blink of an eye, you have what we would deem as civilization, with a host of inventions, with advanced cities, building techniques, math, sciences, even things like positions that you would have, like there would be professional positions, not just labor. There's so many different things. It would be astounding when you consider, but how just within 200 years. Then you look at the language, and the language is what's known as a language isolate, meaning it's not at all related to any of the languages nearby. So the question then becomes, how did they get this? And look at their actual text, and they claim themselves that somebody else came and gave this to them. So that's where you can, if you, rather than translate, say interpret, you could interpret or sublimate over this a story of alien invaders that come down and, you know, subjugate the people, and that makes for a great story. And there actually is plenty of evidence for that if you translate it as such and interpret it as such. But translations, if anybody is, you know, speaks multiple languages, you understand that it's not a one for one. You know, there's concepts, there's different ways of thinking about things, and we're separated by a span of many thousands of years, and the culture at large is very different. And so to be able to kind of plant what you want in there is very possible. And so, but what captures the imagination, of course, is going to be something that comes out and says, hey, I got it, this is the answer. And to very carefully and almost cherry pick the data so that it supports this fantastic question. And again, it's not even to suggest that perhaps there are aliens somewhere, and perhaps even they have visited the planet. But the question of them zooming around in aptly 1960s spaceship technology with nuts and bolts and metal and helmets, and the way it's expressed that they were sort of manipulating our genes was kind of like a Mr. Wizard's World thing, where they're, if you remember that show at all, where they're having beakers and white lab coats, and it becomes very fun for people, but it's also, I mean, dare I say, preposterous. So you at that point then have these people who are trying to fill this vacuum, and on one camp you have the question of, well, it must be that only Semites, so-called Semites, had lived in early Babylon, so Semites must have invented the writing. And the loudest sort of voice of that was an Ottoman-born Jewish French scholar and a Zionist of the pre-Herzl kind. And so from 1874, his name was Joseph Halevi, And from 1874, he argued at length that the Sumerian language was not a language at all. He said it was an artificial priestly cipher invented by the Semitic Babylonians. And it was a sacred code that no people could really understand, except perhaps Hebrew scholars later, which incidentally, that's what was the background of Sitchin. He was an armchair Hebrew scholar. He was actually an economic historian and other things. But the most prominent Jewish scholar in founding that debate, though, he tried so hard to position it as there were no Sumerians, that it was actually Semitic people that were in Babylonian captivity. And even so much that the Encyclopedia Judaica names this motive outright and called it Semitic pride. So it's not something that people run from. So that was the beginning of sort of trying to figure out these tablets and figuring out, well, how did these people come about? Why were they so advanced so quickly? And then you have people arguing back and forth. And it worked for a while. That was the running idea. And this individual, Frederick Delitzsch, was the leading Assyriologist in Germany. And he held that very position for about 12 years. And so 12 years, he was going along with the concept that these were actually Semites that sort of invented this language and this sort of thing. But then he found different information that came out of the Penn Museum, some of the excavations at Nippur from like the late 1880s. And he created a lexical and grammatical work and started looking more deeply into it. And he thought, you can't argue away a spoken language. And he just had a whole shift. And so then he had this mindset shift, and he had to write about it in what he called the Great Deception. And so he was the leading Assyriologist at the time. He had put the grammar and the lexicon out of Mesopotamian languages. He was a chair at the university. I think it was in Berlin. So I forget which university, but he was the chair of Assyriology. He was actually the son of another famous Christian Hebraist, and essentially a missionary too. And so he was forever in his life looking into these things. And in 1902, he delivered 2 lectures. One of them was Babel and Bible, and he put that out to the German Oriental Society. And then he discussed the so-called Great Deception, where from his point of view, a great deal of the Old Testament was actually borrowed from older Babylonian sources. So he said the creation account, the flood, the Sabbath, and portions of the law in general, even the land of Canaan itself, he argued was already sort of saturated with this Babylonian culture before the Israelites even arrived in it. And so he ended up holding 3 small tablets up from the age of Hammurabi, and he reads 3 personal names, and he renders them as Yahweh is God. So if that reading is right, the name of Israel's God is pressed into this Babylonian clay 1,000 years before it was ever had in Israel. So the evidence of Yahweh being a God came way before Israel. And so his view was that this was not a revelation at Sinai, but rather an inheritance from the people weren't allowed to research or do the work. They had to have others help them with that until, long story short, they ended up going to a syndicate of very wealthy Philadelphians through what was called the Babylonian Exploration Fund. And they had contributors like Enoch White Clark, the firm that helped the federal government finance the Mexican-American War. It launched Jay Cook. Who was a 16-year-old clerk who went on to finance the Union War effort and help establish a national currency. And Enoch's son, Clarence Howard Clark, who was president of the First National Bank, which was the first bank that issued federal banknotes. He actually signed the first one. So you have these individuals coming together to put a lot of money into studying the origins of not just Babylon, but more specifically the Sumerians. But it's kind of under this Babylonian cloak. And
sorry, quick question. Forgive me. What year approximately is this Philadelphia Babylonian Exploration Fund and the Penn Museum? What years are they really funding a lot of this research?
1830s, between the
Okay.
1830s and the 1860s. Yeah.
Okay.
So they're doing that. And so there's a whole lot going on at the time, right? This is like a hotbed of exploration, but also cultural change. And but after a while, there different people come through. You get to like the 1900s. There's conspiracies and problems that are very well documented about different people arguing over the meanings of certain tablets, and all of this is just going on within the walls of academia. At this point, it's sort of looked at like nobody knows about the Sumerians because it was something that it wasn't widely shared because it was a couple reasons. One, it did in fact possibly push back the dates of a lot of Old Testament stories, and a lot of people were uncomfortable with that. The researchers weren't necessarily uncomfortable with that, but they didn't at that time see a need to rock the boat. So it was more of a lie by omission kind of thing. It was a need to know basis. But at the time, you just have people who aren't really looking into this, and so it's not widely known. An example would be this. In the Noah's Ark story, of course, many people know this culturally, the Noah loading the animals up on the boat 2 by 2. The older version of it, though, from the Sumerian it's very specific, and it paints a very similar yet different tale, more details. So it talks about their Noah figure. They're able to see things in the stars because they're a great astronomer, and they see that something's going to happen. And rather than pick up all of their family, they look around for the individuals in their culture that are most adept at the sciences and the arts, and those sciences and arts being weights, measures, math, agriculture in particular, medicine, and those sorts of things. Then, and this is where it gets very important, the quote is that they collect all of the animals of the steppe. So in that sense, you have a different picture. You're not saving the entire world's animal population on a boat. You're taking what looks to be like a breakaway civilization. And if you look at when it is estimated that that particular story was written, it was not 6,000 years ago, but it was 12,500 years ago, which coincides with a interesting yet still controversial idea called the Younger Dryas impact event, where it is believed by many, but still contested, that there was a impact that created instantaneous devastation, killing out the Ice Age animals, but also then massive climate change where things froze over, but then they also melted. And so you'd have many floods in different areas, leading to a displacement of individuals, climate migrants, and possibly then a shared oral tradition or cultural memory of a great flood, so that many people may carry that story with them. So incidentally, that story kind of goes back that far in this idea that perhaps there was an individual who gathered up their people with the intent of making a breakaway civilization. In doing so, they were doing this from the Eurasian steppe and taking the animals of the steppe. And if you know about, say, the anthropology of nomadic people in that region, how they've been able to survive, they would take those animals and either make cheese, have dairy, or also in some cases have to bleed the animal for the nutrition, but that would create a non-fatal wound and they would be able to survive that. And that's another nutrient source. And then, of course, if the animal couldn't make it through the journey, that could be used as food too. It's almost like you're taking a mobile agricultural system with you, which would have enabled you to go very far and still maintain nutrition and the memory of your culture and the ability to maybe teach people or understand how to reestablish a civilization. And when you look at these ancient texts, then they do describe a meeting of two peoples, the semi-settled hunter-gatherers at the time, who in the text are referred to by these so-called Anunnaki as the Adamah, which in an Abrahamic faith, it gets interpreted to be the people of the clay, or a man made out of clay. And of course, later we have it called Adam. But in that tradition, it's the idea that God creates the man, Adam, out of clay of the earth, sort of forms him in a little figure. But in the translation that's much older, it means very specifically a man who is red like the clay. It's a very specific red clay. So it's like red clay man. In archaeological excavations in that region, you find the individuals there average height of a grown adult male would be about 5'1". Hunter gatherer, semi settled, so not necessarily so robust. But another thing that you find with them is that in their funerary rites, they put this red clay, this ochre, over their the bodies. And so there have been studies to suggest that perhaps this was something they also did during life, because you see this in indigenous cultures where mud is often used or clay is used as a sun protectant or aesthetic reasons. At the same time, they were described as being the black-headed ones. And if you were also having black hair or somehow had that phenotype, then you wouldn't necessarily call that out about those other people you're encountering. So we're shown sort of a depiction of shorter statured individuals who may have appeared red in color with dark hair, and other individuals who were then described on the other side as the so-called shining ones, which has been, again, this is the problem with translation versus interpretation, because some people have interpreted that as being that they're glowing like aliens, or some people have interpreted as they are shining as in they're very bright, they're very smart and intelligent. Other people have suggested that they had access to metallurgy, which if you look at the proposed regions they may have migrated from, that would have tracked, they would have had early copper metallurgy. So, but it could have been all of that. They're also described as being giants. But again, if you look at the human remains that are found from that region versus the semi-settled hunter-gatherers, the ones who might have had access to animal protein, dairy, and such, they would have been at least bigger in stature. Not necessarily giant, but the thing is, it's about perspective and how we read into these texts. And it's very fun and romantic to consider it like Jack and the Beanstalk level giants. And so you will see people who look and say, well, the Anunnaki were literally giants. They were huge. They're like 20 feet tall. And then we get into that perspective. So you can see too, as I'm saying this, there could be a lot of problems or potential problematic statements here, conclusions made, because what it does appear to be is that you have a group of individuals coming from the north descending down who also are described as having blue eyes, which is why the evil eye is considered blue. You weren't allowed to look at it. It was very powerful and scary. And most of the Anunnaki statues, their eyes were made of lapis lazuli, which were blue. And you do see then, especially coming out of the research from Harvard's Genetic Institute run by Reich, he's done a really good job of tracing this. He usually has to come out and say, well, I'm sorry for this data. It doesn't look good, but don't shoot the messenger. We're just getting the hard science now, which does trace like a blue-eyed gene to the region entering at about roughly the same time, and all of the lore coming along with it. So again, you can see this is rife with the opportunity to make claims about different people having different supremacy and this sort of thing. And that's exactly what was happening at the time in the 1800s. They were trying to figure this out. But over time, what we see is this narrative jump into something that is more of a fairy tale or alien type question. But you have another layer of this too with archaeology, no pun intended with the layers, but you have the fact that it is a so-called soft science, a lot of room for revision, a lot of room for narrative control, and it also involves going to different places with different people and possibly reinventing people's backgrounds and stories and redrawing the lines of the map. So what we have later is archaeology as statecraft, and it's specifically wrapped up with spycraft. And so this is one that is really not argued about. It's just not talked about clearly, because anthropology, they do a lot to try to distance themselves from their bad past of social injustice, and especially because a lot of times in the West, they're the ones spearheading a lot of the sort of what we would consider maybe culture war type things. So they're doing that sort of cleanup because their origins come from a place where it's complete financial exploitation, subjugation, and supremacy of all types, and also spycraft. And so this was most notably a figure named Gertrude Bell, who is a wealthy English from a wealthy English industrial family, and she was so well read and could speak Arabic and Persian, that she could travel places that other women hadn't been able to. So she had a little bit special privilege there. And in 1913, she goes under the cover of an archaeological research excavation. She goes to Hale and she starts kind of on behalf of the British government trying to ascertain the strengths of the Al Rashid family. And so she goes then inside Cairo intelligence and starts the Arab Bureau. And in 1917, then Baghdad falls to the British and she becomes the Oriental Secretary to the Higher Commissioner. And then so you get in the early 20s, this Cairo conference has Churchill presiding, and she backs, well, let's just say they name her and T.E. Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia, they named them the Kingmakers, because most of what they did was go through and try to learn the culture in order to subvert the culture and try to figure out how to, essentially redraw these maps. So it's the literal king making and literal map drawing done by archaeologists. And it's still done to this day, where this is why, I have archaeologist friends who complain that in Turkey they've been detained and asked questions. And it's like, yes, but on the other hand, it's because most people understand that this is still being used as spycraft. You can go over there, you get special privileges, you're talking to people, and you're able to then get a lot of intel through that. So it has a sordid history, and it does go then, of course, into more occult genres, because you have this vacuum of the Sumerian problem and everybody wanting to fill the vacuums. And now you're having just different regions drawn, people looking for supremacy, same things that, we're pretty much dealing with today, or we're dealing with the ramifications left from them today. And you have, all the way to, say, Blavatsky then with the root races, Atlantis, superhuman teachers from elsewhere. And those things were actually cited, the concepts from the secret doctrine started to be cited by von Daniken and others as like a very important, they didn't admit to being occultists. It was sort of just put in there like this early New Age kind of movement, and whitewashed it a little bit. But this is then where we start to see the merging of these ideas with what would later become alien races. And so it goes into a whole story of Lemurians and Atlantis, and then you have the Nordic races of these aliens that people are very interested in now. There was a meme going around recently with Trump, who was supposedly out there talking to these so-called Nordics that are just very tall and blonde, and used to be thought that they came from Venus. And so this was way before people were thinking they were these alien grays. But in 1950, Velikovsky wrote a book called Worlds in Collision, and it trained a mass readership to read ancient texts as coded records of real cosmic events. That was still sort of the Academy's standard comparison for Sitchin's method. So Sitchin, this was all happening before Sitchin. There was, of course, Lovecraft and some of these works, but I would say the von Daniken and Velikovsky's work really set the stage. And then you have von Daniken in 1968 doing Chariots of the Gods, and that ended up selling 7 million copies. And I knew von Daniken, and he was an interesting character who, he was raised a strict Catholic, but it was from Switzerland. He kind of had his own agenda a little bit, but this idea that he was an occultist, I don't know if it stands up much. I think he was actually plain old grifter. He was convicted of fraud and embezzlement and sentenced in 1970. And in a Playboy interview in like 1974, he admitted to having totally contrived the evidence. And his publisher was later forced to add some different things to the bibliography to head off what was going to be a plagiarism lawsuit. And then I forget which year, but he ended up making a theme park. I think it was called Mystery Park, and it totally went under. So he was kind of like the Barnum and Bailey guy of it. And as he got older, I knew him in his later years, he just was riding the circuit. A lot of his ideas had changed completely. I think he almost got into it. I think he made a monster for himself, probably was interested in it, but from what he had told me, the things that were proposed in Chariots of the Gods were far different than what he would have believed before he passed. So he was an interesting character. I think that he was probably more about this entertainment and grift of everything. But then you have the 12th planet. And that same year, Robert Temple publishes The Serious Mystery. And that's a completely separate case for ancient contact built on the star knowledge of the Dogon people rather than, say, the Sumerians. So this is all kind of bubbling up at the same time, and people are very interested in it. But Sitchin then comes in and puts this whole really wild idea out there, and it's very well developed and it's very detailed, and that's why it can capture so many people today, because it's almost like a like a franchise, like you can really get into it and read book one, and then you have all the characters and all of this. So and it is, I wouldn't even call it loosely based. It is very much based on the Sumerian, but it's just, again, with the little tricks and things on how he decided to portray it, or also the personality of him. He was known by anybody I know that knew him, even if they don't publicly say so, they all agree that he was just an awful person, that he was just like unchallengeable, that he, just he had an agenda. That was always kind of the idea. But people usually were saying the agenda was that he just wanted to make money, or put forth this idea of the Sumerian gods being aliens. But when you think about, this is where I started to do a little bit of a deeper dive into Sitchin, because as I start writing the books about the Anunnaki, because I'm interested, I'm like, what is going on here, right? There's this weird historiography where people are fighting over the supremacy of the first civilizations and such. And Sitchin is the prevailing voice. And Michael Heiser, again, was like the counter voice, and he had passed. And again, he the only counter you could offer then, because of that, was the one based on like a very evangelical Christian perspective. Other than that, you had nothing. And people would come at you for even questioning either of these people, because it was literally a cult of personality. People would be stuck in this binary. So I start looking more into Sitchin, and primarily some of the claims too. And I was guilty of this, of kind of going and putting forth the standard academic line that was put forth by Samuel Noah Kramer in the 50s, who was another Sumerologist and a Assyriologist who kind of popularized. He wrote a very accessible books, and one of them was about all of the amazing things that Sumer did first. And upon looking, though, further into it, and mostly by speaking to other legitimate archaeologists and universities across the world, by being a member of the World Archaeological Congress and not the American Anthropological Association, I found that there's clear accepted evidence globally that half of these things weren't the case. So, for instance, like the oldest wheeled cart was not from Sumer, but rather outside of Poland. A lot of different things that they are sort of attributing to the Sumerians that are not the case. So, I had to re-examine that a little bit, and then it made me re-examine a lot of things. And this is where you find out, okay, most people think of Sitchin as this, maybe he was a historian. They'll give him that. They'll say he was a historian, and he taught himself these languages because of his ability to speak Hebrew. And then he's just this lone scholar, and that he was the only person that could understand this, and people rejected his scholarship because clearly it's controversial, etc. But we find about Sitchin is that he was actually born in 1920 in or near Baku. He was raised in Mandatory Palestine, and he was fluent in Hebrew, but steeped in Old Testament from childhood. He had an economics degree that he got in London, and he served in the British Army, but then he served in the Israeli Army until 1949. And then he moved to New York in 1952, and he spent decades as a shipping executive and journalist before publishing his Anunnaki books. And so he had 24 years in New York working in commerce, and he was sort of a soldier and at that time, a Zionist activist. And he was the founding director of the American Israel Chamber of Commerce and Industry, chairman of the American Israel Pavilion at the 1964-65 World's Fair in New York. And even his wife was very much working on behalf of the Zionist cause. And so he went to Independence to see. This is a little strange, but the Truman Library has a corrected draft of a press release. Okay, that was the only thing that was on record at all, where the United States declared the state of Israel in any sort of way, shape, or form. And it was just a simple press release that wasn't signed. It just was like, basically, we here recognize the state of Israel, 1948, done, nothing else. And so that single sheet of paper became this object that Israel was interested in. And it ended up getting in the hands of Sitchin because of his connection to the World's Fair. And he made an exhibit out of it. And then he made it his mission, and with the help of the Israeli embassy, to get it actually signed by Truman. And so in January of 1965, Truman signed Sitchin's paper, and with him there, and Sitchin then kept that too. So he had it in his possession for a long time, and it wasn't until he passed that it went up for auction. But it is the official sort of signed document of it. And when you look at it in the context of, say, museums or just historical societies, they simply say, Sitchin was this great Zionist activist, and he did all these great things. Oh, and he happened to also be, funny enough, an author who questions the narrative of whether or not we're alone in the universe. Like, it's very just, isn't that a quirk of his? And so it struck me as interesting that all of the people who are just followers of Sitchin never seemed to know about that, never seemed to then wonder, like, why his very last speech that he gave, that's behind a paywall of his own site, was on Jerusalem and the importance of keeping Jerusalem in the hands of the Jewish people, because that's where the Anunnaki are going to land, because that's where they came from, and they're going to come back in their spacecraft and set everything right for everybody. And of course, the people who accept the Anunnaki are going to help rule the world, and it just gets a little bit like heavy-handed, but some of that's hidden behind multiple paywalls and this sort of thing.
When did he say this? Sorry.
I want to say, you have to probably Google it, but it was like shortly before he died. So 2000, and yeah, not sure exactly when.
But it's like one of the last things he put out publicly before he died.
It was his very last lecture. Wow. I'm not sure that he knew that he was on his way out. I don't know, if it was just a coincidence. But yeah, he died in 2010. So it was probably 2009 or 2010 that he put that out there. Wow. And it's still available, and people can watch it. You have to pay like $1 to the family to watch it. So well worth it, because if you can sit by, it's worth it as an ethnographical study, because he's there in front of an audience of just very happy people to just, they're his fans. And so he's able to just play the crowd, and you can see how he frames the arguments, and it's quite a sight. So you have that, and now you have what is now, since he's dead and Michael Heiser's passed too, you have what I like to refer to as Anunnaki Inc. It is a machine. You have people like Billy Carson. You have people who are wrapped up with the television media space called Gaia Television. But Billy Carson is one that I like to pick on, because he's out there talking about the Anunnaki and telling people, sign up for this, you'll get a raffle for a convertible Bentley. Here's a Rolls Royce. It becomes like a prosperity gospel kind of thing, and a multi-level marketing scam. And it's like, how did something like this? I mean, I've kind of given the full history to an extent on the origins of the questions over the Sumerians and archaeology itself. And how does something like that now, in this era, in the 2020s, become a multi-level marketing scheme meant to give people a Rolls Royce if you sign up to believe in these ideas about the Anunnaki being coming to save us, or something to that effect? So strange things, but it often, at least in my view, has pointed, as somebody who's been on the inside of this as well, and spoken with these people, spoken with the executives of these shows who, would like to have me on or push these agendas, which I will clearly not, but I do believe that the underlying reason for all of this is to try to get everybody united into the notion of a one world religion that is going to be head by these, they're going to call them aliens, but they could also be seen as ascended masters, angels, whatever they want to call them. It's going to be all an ecumenical design. But I think that it does have more to do with the one world religion that they're trying to push out, that's steeped in theosophy and kind of cloaked in new science fiction kind of terminology. And the person who paved the way for that was Sitchin with his 12th planet and spaceships and whatnot. And you see it trickle into the media everywhere now. So that's sort of, I mean, that's in a nutshell what I'm kind of working in and working on. And yeah, so it's a lot, but
That's good. That's good. No, you threw in some twists that I wasn't fully anticipating. That's great. And just weaving together the story of what's her name, the T. Lawrence Kingmaker woman,
Gertrude Bell,
Gertrude Bell. Yeah. That is so important to weave together this whole Palestinian exploration fund that creates the British Mandate Palestine, that has this whole objective, which is very confusing for people, and they often treat it in a completely separate modality from the analysis of the whole fight over the science of archaeology, the fight over the story of our origins, and what you've said is very insightful. And I'm going to have some questions for you, but I'm going to hold back because I know the audience definitely wants to throw some stuff at you. Starting with the first person that I saw get in there with a question was Monty. Monty, I know you had something to say. Go for it.
Yes, just curious. I was always fascinated by this concept, where this concept erupted of man made in the image of God. I first ran across it later in years with Nicholas Acusa, the 15th century Council of Florence, which came up with the term and the concept of imago viva Dei and capax Dei. In other words, the manifestation of God through man. But in earlier works, I did run across this term Shekinah, which seems to have been usurped by the Talmud and Gnostics. But my understanding is the original meaning may have gone back to Babylon, meaning the manifestation and divine presence of God in man, as opposed to the Hebrew transcendence of God as something other. Do you have any insight into that?
Yeah, so I think that there are many of the things. This is probably why it's so interesting to look so deeply into these tablets and their translations, and probably why it's cloaked a lot. And they would prefer us to think of it all as just aliens or what have you. But currently, there are 500,000 Sumerian tablets held in museums and universities right now, with many millions to still be discovered, and many of them not interpreted or translated in any way. And they're trying to use AI now to do that, but that's like a whole different story. So you can see here some of the issues, right? And so you're right to point out that while the word Shekinah is like Hebrew, a lot of these things have their origins in the Sumerian. And so there's a lot of parallels one for one, and maybe the wording is a little bit different because of the etymology and the shift towards from like cuneiform onward. And so, but in the Hebrew, it does mean to dwell. It's the indwelling or settled presence of God, just that. And so it doesn't come out till later in, like, as you mentioned, the Talmud, where it starts to get a little bit different, as in the female presence of God. That becomes like a Kabbalistic view of it. And so you see it changing over and over. But the very oldest way that we understand it is simply not gendered or anything to that effect, and not even the presence of God in the tabernacle, which later it becomes. It is originally just the indwelling, settled presence of God. And that does have roots in the Sumerian, more so though, I think, with the question of Ishtar and Inanna, that divine feminine presence. And I think what ended up happening is that some of those larger terms, there was like a religious syncretism that happened after Babylonian captivity, and you have this feminine presence take on the aspects of Ishtar and Anna, and they kind of merge together. So I think it's just I think the original was just simply the indwelling place of God, and then later it became more of a divine feminine kind of thing. And then of course, within the Zohar, it becomes this concept of Malkut, which is the 10th and lowest sephira in the tree of life. And so that becomes a receptive vessel at the bottom of this like emanated order, which then it's that, because it's a receiver, that's where it really takes on this divine feminine component. And when you see individuals maybe at the Wailing Wall, for instance, and they're doing like rocking back and forth, that is their practice to call down this particular version of Shekinah, which is that feminine presence, and it's a vessel. And then you have essentially what is like a spiritual intercourse that's happening there, but it's like a capture of this vessel. So you can see too, and then later Christian occult tradition picks her up, and that is sometimes looked at as Sophia or the light, and you can see it all has its links to that. But the very, very oldest is just simply the dwelling place of God, and then it becomes gendered and then like syncretized from Inanna and Ishtar. I don't know if that helps, but yeah.
I got a quick question before I go to Stephen. But before I go to Stephen. When you brought up Joseph Halevi from, I guess that was, oh no, that wasn't the guy who wrote The Great Deception and Babylon Bible. That was a different guy, right?
Yeah, deletes.
Leech. Okay, I gotta look into these things. But I think it was Halevi who said that Sumerian wasn't its own thing. It was like a cipher language specifically. It wasn't an authentic, like decipherable language beyond it being cipher. Like it was basically, yeah, just symbolic. And only Hebrew scholars were equipped to decipher this language. Could you add a little bit more detail, because it does seem like in the Kabbalistic mentality that it's all about ciphers, it's all about numerology and things like that they're looking for embedded as codes within their Torah, within various other apocryphal scripture or literature. But there's a connection, as you've pointed out, to the Sumerian language. So number one, when was it deciphered, and when did it become something that was recognized as having a valid syntax and grammar and language that was decipherable, that wasn't simply just codes, but that also, where does the tradition, how did it continue? Because it does seem like there is a certain type of encoding in some of the literatures and tablets as well. So could you maybe just add a little bit to that so that I'm less confused?
Yeah, for sure. So cuneiform as a script was deciphered in like 1857. They did like a blind test of excavated tablets. It went to 4 scholars in isolation, and they had a jury that convened for it. And so at that point, Akkadian, the Semitic language, sort of helped them figure this out too. The Behistun in Iran, that was sort of like a Rosetta Stone, if anyone's familiar with that. They were able to check that out for hieroglyphs, and it took them about 55 years to render this verdict. So I mean, they did their due diligence with it. Sumerian as a language, it's kind of arguably a question still in progress. So in 1849, it was a gentleman by the name of Hinks that said Akkadian couldn't be the language that it was designed for. A guy named Oppert named it cuneiform in 1869. It's named cuni after wedge form, after just the form of writing. So it's named as such because they would use reed styluses, and they would be a wedge shape, and you take the clay and while it's wet and you press that into the clay and let it dry. And so it was wedge shaped. So that's where cuneiform came from. And then over time, it was like more years of arguing whether it did exist or didn't exist. And so it wasn't until like 1857 that Assyriology became something that was a credentialed science, and it was it's still argued a little bit. So there is that. But they want to have you think it's all just like ready to go. But there's always these questions, right? And you can look on Oxford's website. There's some really great Sumerian dictionaries and things that you can look at for yourself and at least try to work through it. So again, with this like Anunnaki Inks mythos about how nobody can read these and it's very special. It's like there you can go to a bookstore and get the books. Irving Finkel at the British Museum has like numerous books and things, and even little videos on YouTube helping people know cuneiform. So yeah, but Halevi's claim was that the Sumerian language was never actually spoken at all. So more to your point about how it was like a cipher or something like that, he claimed that it was an artificial graphic system, and specifically a cipher used by the priest class that was invented by the Semitic Babylonians for writing their own Semitic language in a sacred and deliberately obscure way. And it pretty much does track with that. So he claims it wouldn't have been a different tongue, a different language, but just a different, say, costume or a different look for the same language. And that would be allography. So that's what that's referred to. It's one language, but two writing systems. One, the second being esoteric and restricted to a scribal priest class. And, he had reasons in 1870s to think that, because nearly all the Sumerian anyone had at that point came from bilingual texts. So you'd have the Sumerian lines with Akkadian translations underneath, and those were produced specifically in the scribal schools. And even the grammatical exercises and lists, they had schools where people would go to learn this, and little practice tablets and everything. And we're talking lots. So they had plenty to look at, and there were always these little like Sumerian lines with the Akkadian translations underneath. If the only place you ever see a language is, a classroom, it's right there. And it was taught specifically to the priests of that classroom. And so it was kind of apparent that, okay, this is for the scribal class. So it's not the worst idea at all. In fact, it very well could be. He argued that the apparent Sumerian words were logograms with pronunciations invented after the fact. And some of them, proto-cuneiform, are like pictograms, and then you can see how they develop into logograms. And so again, it's still kind of, in debate, but eventually that whole idea was killed off in the late 1800s, from that Pennsylvania, the Penn expedition at Nippur from 1888 that was funded by all the bankers and things. At that point, they shut that down because they were able to find monolingual Sumerian text that didn't have the Akkadian anywhere near them. So initially it was just the school kids and scribal artifacts. And now they were able to see royal inscriptions. They had the Gudea cylinders. They had temple hymns and tons of administrative documents. Like I always like to point to, because again, 500,000 tablets, not all of those are these profound religious revelations. Most of them are administrative, including, and I think it's in the University of Chicago, is legitimately the first known customer complaint. And it is a tablet that discusses in great detail. It's quite humorous. If you Google it and find the translation, it's funny, because it was somebody who, they were selling metal ingots. And over time, everybody knew, because many tablets were found with this very infamous guy who was selling tablets, or he was selling these ingots that were hollow inside. So he was like weighting them wrongly. And people were complaining, and they actually found most of these complaints at his own workshop. Like, so he had them, he just didn't respond to them. And one of them just goes on and on saying, I sent my best courier over to you in very dangerous lands, and you told me this would be great. And here it is. It's nothing like you promised. And I don't want my money back. In fact, and it just goes on and on like a very typical Yelp review. So many of the documents have things like that. There's even a great document from a story of a school kid who is coming to class with his clay cuneiform tablets, and he's late every single day. And he gets beaten with a rod by the teacher. And he goes home and tells his father, and his father says, I'll fix this for you. And he invites the teacher over to dinner, and the dad gives him all these like really nice food and drink and like a gift or something. I forget what it was, some sort of textile. And then after that, the boy was late, but he didn't get in trouble anymore. And it was this sort of story of how you're supposed to, kind of do favors for people. So there's plenty of really great administrative documents and everyday documents about these people, which unfortunately it does get overshadowed by just this whole like, oh, they're all aliens and coming to take our gold and this sort of thing. But there was in the British Museum, there's about 660 texts that are all medical texts that at the time, of course, they were priests and physicians. They didn't separate the two. And so they're all exorcisms as well. And to this day, what people would commonly think of as a Catholic exorcism that would be depicted in films like The Exorcist, where those things of, a person acting very strangely, and then the priest would demand to know the name of the demon, that comes straight from the Mesopotamian practice, because in a sort of proto-diagnostic sense, what they would be doing is coming to somebody's house after hearing that, okay, this person has a demon, they're throwing up, they have a fever, they have a cough. No, they don't have a cough. So they would take all of these symptoms and say, well, then it must be this demon. And then they would know which pills to use, what beers to use. They use beer. They would know what to do, and they would have to know the name of the demon in order to exorcise it, because that was essentially saying like, all right, you got all this like illness, whatever. What is it? It's norovirus is the name of the demon. Okay, well, we know what to do for this. So it was like a diagnostic sense. And they even have a Mesopotamian toilet demon, which was, you had to be very careful because it hit specifically middle-aged and older men who are overweight and known to drink a lot. And they would sit on the toilet, and when they would be going and doing their business, sometimes they would die of what appeared to be a stroke or cardiovascular event. And so that was the Mesopotamian toilet demon. But we know now with medicine that maybe some of those risk factors contributed to, an Elvis style end. So, but now we know that. And but it's a shame that so much of this really interesting history has just been kind of washed over by spycraft and the occult and people looking to assert themselves as the ascended bloodline that's meant to rule over everybody. And that's where it was really strange to me, where, eventually I get contacted by people who are in these different Freemasonic, loosely organized Freemasonic organizations that really do try to link themselves to this particular quote Anunnaki bloodline and establish themselves as having the clear right to rule over us. And so it's a little strange, but I wouldn't doubt though that the Sumerian is a cipher language. I don't think that's a really bad way of looking at it either. It's just not one that's now accepted. But what Napoleon said is, what is history but a fable agreed upon? So it's all about consensus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you. Stephen, are you still there? Did you want to ask your question, or you want to wait a little bit more to formulate it?
No, I can do it. Kind of excited because this gets into one of my great love research areas of interest and reading areas. So really appreciate your talk, Heather. When I look at kind of the broader question, to me, you can at the highest level kind of break it down into two main sub questions. One, is there any truth at all to these kind of suspicions, allegations, whatever of advanced civilization of the past, or contact, or caretaker groups, whatever you want to call them, followers of Horus? And to my mind, the other question is, if we allow ourselves to say that there is some entity out there, some deep states, the elites, whatever you want to call it, the other question is, if they believe this to be true, independent of whether or not it is true, would that guide their actions? How so, and what can we infer from that? So, for example, you look at Iraq and this whole 9/11 association that was, and weapons of mass destruction at the time, that was kind of used to justify the invasion. I mean, we can say geopolitics and Halford Mackinder, and we can say oil and pipelines and all that sort of stuff. But I've also read allegations that artifact retrieval was one of the deeper layers of that onion, for lack of a better term. And then getting into the psyops of it all, are there limited hangouts? Are there, if there is a controlling group that believes there is truth to this, independent of the question itself, would they create limited hangouts? Would they create the Alex Jones of the ancient alien world, for lack of a better term? So I'm just wondering if you thought of that, have you dug into that, and kind of maybe expand upon that duality and your views on it?
Oh no, I think that's exactly, you hit the nail on the head completely. Especially when it comes to the limited hangouts component, I think that's what most of the ancient aliens thing is now, which I call like Anunnaki Inc. But it does cover all of the different aliens, whether they be grays or the so-called disclosure that people are saying that we're experiencing and this sort of thing. So, which is funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. Lawrence Rockefeller in particular had a keen interest in some of the big players that are on the disclosure scene right now. And also, strangely enough, a Canadian billionaire who decided that he was very interested in Enki and Enlil, and ended up paying a whole lot of money to Dr. Stephen Greer to sort of fund some of his operations after Lawrence Rockefeller sort of cooled off as a money source. And then you have him, this guy's name's Tom Clearwater. You have him funding a little bit of Marco Rubio and Kirsten Gillibrand's work and the congressional hearings on UFOs and UAPs. And so there's usually this weird sort of connection to deep state and actually global connections as well. But the question about too some of the motives in going into Iraq, that sounds sometimes to people preposterous, because we know there's a lot of things that happen in war and whatnot, but some people think that it would be preposterous. But it is on record that there was a looting in 2003, and early press reports showed like almost 200,000 items were taken. And there was an individual who ran a military investigation, and this went to court. I mean, there's all the records on this, that this did in fact happen. But the details are, I think, really important in this one. It wasn't just a looting because it's like, oh, these are valuable or what have you. The details show that the specific things were not taken that should have been offered on the black market and lots of money. Very specific things were taken, and they were strategically taken. Like, it was described that they had a list of what it was they were going for. And so they stole about 5,000 cylinder seals. And so if you're familiar with cylinder seals, or tablets, sometimes if you hear that, you might think of the old Charlton Heston holding up tablets, but these things were actually quite small. And so just to put that in your mind, they would have been beaded, like the cylinder seal itself could be worn as a bead. So that's how, if you hear 5,000 of them, yes, 5,000, because they're small. And so you could take bags. They would literally have canvas bags of these. They're just hauling out. And that was taken from a room that actually required very specific knowledge of the layout and where they were, and also having keys. And so they went strategically to look for very specific things. Galleries were ransacked, and the basement, though, was specifically shopped for. They knew what they were looking for. And so that's a little bit strange. And people, there's another connection too. You might have heard in the news, Hobby Lobby, the arts and craft chain. They settled in 2017 for having over 5,000 artifacts, including one of the most important ones that was called the Gilgamesh Dream Tablet, that was bought through Christie's in 2014, but was seized again from Iraq, and it was returned. And so this is a constant thing that's been going on. And interesting enough, to Robert Gates, who was deputy director for intelligence and then a deputy national security advisor during the 80s, towards like Saddam Hussein era and the Iran-Iraq war. He ended up getting very involved in 2003 with he had a real keen interest in Mesopotamian history, and specifically Gilgamesh and all of this. And you'll sometimes hear people say they were looking for Gilgamesh's tomb. And I can't comment on that, but I did see for myself the WikiLeaks emails where it did seem as though this was something that they were interested in and looking for. And again, when people say, oh, it's so strange, like, why are they looking for these artifacts? And it's just, it's always important to note that, on a Nurbe, this is what people do. And I think you aptly put it, that it doesn't even matter at a level of if any of this is real or relevant, because if the people in positions of power who are starting wars or, deciding what's happening to us at all these levels, if they're believing things, then we need to take it very seriously. And sometimes they believe things. And again, we can't know if it's true. Maybe they are summoning these entities. Maybe they're not. But at some level, it doesn't matter because they're doing these things and acting upon it, and we're going to suffer the consequences.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And can I just do a follow on that?
Yeah, go for it.
Just quickly to close up on this one too, if you believe there's truth in that, or if there is a tomb of Gilgamesh, and you're believing that, you'd obviously want the DNA to check to see if there's any demonstrable difference between that DNA and the general population. I mean, we could speculate on 23andMe and the family connection to Google and all that sort of stuff. So I won't go there. But yeah, it's a fascinating topic. Back to the other half of that question of if there is any truth to this at all. And I'm a Hapgood's Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings guy, so that's kind of how I came into the field. And I look at it. Strangely enough, it's kind of a link into one of Matt, the central thesis in terms of Leibniz and the whole natural law and our Creator giving us these talents and wanting to use them for beneficial things, and how quickly we can develop that for the general welfare. So if you go back to some epoch in history and someone embraces that, how quickly technology could have advanced back then. Have you looked at any of the engineering or science arguments based on things, whether it's Christopher Dunn's engineering arguments for the Giza complex, or from a Masonic angle, Knight Lomas Butler looking at the work of Alexander Thom and the standard unit of measurement he found in all the megalithic sites in the UK and around? Have you explored those angles, or Thomas Brophy's origin map, the astronomer?
So in terms of, like, say, astroarchaeology, yes, definitely. If there's a possibility, like, I'm very much open to the possibility that there have been advanced civilizations before what we would consider advanced. It would just be the question of, what does that look like? What's advanced? Because it might, because of the way we have language, and the wizardry that's pulled on us in the world, especially by film industry, that could imply that people are buzzing around in spaceships and having the internet, and it wouldn't have to look like that. So when it comes to something like the genetic manipulation, they wouldn't have to necessarily know CRISPR and be splicing genes. And what they could have been doing instead, which is sort of what they spoke about, was good old fashioned animal husbandry, because they were able to teach everybody how to breed certain animals for domestication. But at the same time, running parallel to this, they put strict guidelines over who could be with whom. So that was this is where you get like some of that Nephilim idea coming through, where it's like the Anunnaki, they were told they couldn't mix with the humans, the so-called humans, and they called them the black-headed ones. They couldn't mix. And then eventually they had the Promethean type figure of Enki, who felt bad and started to go to those people and share with them the knowledge that later would be called the wisdom of Enki. But the knowledge was the word. It was how to teach them to speak and understand language, so that the priest class would no longer be needed in the same way. And then they would be able to have this kind of understanding of the world around them. But the breakdown started happening when they were breeding with each other, and then making giants and making, all of this. And so you see this in various texts and various ways, all these prohibitions on who could marry whom. And so in a lot of ways, I guess Occam's razor for me would just say, if they were trying to breed a slave species, they could have just done it by using the same principles they had used to dominate animals, and looking at the individuals they came across as animals, and those individuals kind of having a cargo cult relationship with them and thinking they're gods, and then this sort of thing happening. But I would think that there's a pretty good evidence for advanced peoples, and how they were advanced, I think, does lie more so with innate abilities. What those could be, I don't know. Maybe that is what it does seem to be what the occultists are looking for, is this notion that Maybe some people with certain bloodlines have an ability to have a psychic ability or somehow have some sort of more innate powers in an unseen way. So I know that one of the artifacts of interests is the Tablet of Destinies. That one contained, we don't have it, but this one comes out of the myth, many myths, but one of them, it's the Epic of Gilgamesh touches on it. But the Tablet of Destinies is this tablet that contains the maze, which are spelled M-E, and those are all of the things you would need to know for civilization. And you would have all of the edicts, like everything that you would need to know to have a civilization start over again. And anyone who had this tablet had all the knowledge and power, and they then therefore had the divine right to rule, and they could also see the past, present, and future. They knew the fates. And so it was a very hotly contested artifact. And to this day, people are looking for it. If I had to if I had to guess what was on it, and if there was something real to it, I would say it would be a mathematic code, because they were very much known for, and still are known for, their great advances in math. To this day, there have been researchers, mostly in the UK, who are mathematicians and especially in the fields of like geometry, where they're trying to figure out really extensive problems. They have computers, they have technology, and they have grad students who are just here to help. And yet they've been able to crack those codes by going and working with the British Museum to take a look at some of these Sumerian tablets, where they have found the answers to some of the most pressing contemporary questions that artificial intelligence, intelligent people, and computers haven't been able to solve. And this is all in peer-reviewed research, by the way, too. So it's legitimate research. So if you know this, and you know people like Epstein who are trying to fund all of these alternative ideas, and Atlantis or whatever, it's been my view, and I've written on this, that they think perhaps there could be a code for that could help break apart entropy. They want to defeat death. And so, not to go too deep into that, but that's where I'm leaning right now. The quest for free energy, you'll hear that a lot with this like UFO question. But the question I always have, it's like, rather than say, are there stargates, ask, what exactly do they think a stargate is? Likewise, when people say free energy, do we really think that what they're doing is trying to hoard or keep away from us the ability to simply travel freely, even across the universe? Perhaps. Is it really that we would be able to power all of our homes for free, and they don't want us to have that? Perhaps. But the thing is they could have that now. They wouldn't give it to us. So I think that the bigger question is, what is the underlying mathematical premise of forever energy? Because they're looking at it in a multidisciplinary, not even interdisciplinary sense, but they're siloing that in fields of both biology and communication study as well. And they look at entropy in physics. So if they're kind of doing the blind man and the elephant thing, where you have an elephant standing there and one man holding the tail and the other holding a trunk, and they're not seeing what the other's doing and they're arguing about it, they do this sometimes by design so that they can do sort of a blind study. So if in this particular discipline they come up with an axiomatic principle, like it's this equation, over here in, say, biology, it's doing the same, then perhaps they can come down to the core of the truth in the question, which is how to live forever, because that's the ultimate energy. Because I mean, who cares if you can fly around in a spaceship or, have free electricity for the rest of your life or whatever, beat electricity, if you're just still going to die at 80 years old. I think we know from their behavior, their interest in biohacking and everything else and transhumanist agenda, it's most likely what they're looking for is the underlying principle of that. And the rest is a consequence or a ruse so that physicists are studying these types of things. But what they'll get out of it, as the people who can see the entire elephant, would be the quest for immortality, just like the Epic of Gilgamesh was all about.
Mm. Yeah, I was reading the biography, the official biography of the Esalen Institute by Jeffrey Kripal, who's this Kali initiate, and he's like the official spokesman for Esalen. And one of the themes in that book is this idea immortality being physical. He's like, one of the purposes of the human potential movement that Aldous Huxley put online and that inspired Michael Murphy and Pat Price and all these guys to create the SLN was to manifest this concept that immortality is not for the domain of metaphysics and the soul, but that the body itself is consubstantial with our idea of the transcendence of the soul, and that the body itself is destined to basically beat death and become immortal. So it's interesting what you're saying, that they take this, there's like a degree of truthfulness that we should always look to make life better for ourselves, and that, you know, our journey in exploring and mapping the universe should be able to feed back into uplifting the life and the minds of the people. But they take an element of that and then they infuse a lot of misanthropy, and they say, oh, okay, we like the improvement side of things, but we hate people. So the kind of benefit of this technology and everything else is we're gonna allow it only for those who are part of the collective, or not the collective, the vetted club of those who have sort of, I guess, gone through the steps of breaking their humanity first, and in order to be allowed in the club, and then you're allowed to benefit from the secret doctrine or whatever else, and it gets kind of gross.
And you know, what's funny too is all the efforts done, and especially out of the research. It's an institution for longevity in La Jolla, California. I forget the name of it, but they've been wrapped up with Peter Attia, who we know fell from grace after all of the really bad emails came out with him and Epstein and other biohackers and people who are interested in longevity. Part of what they were doing and are still working on is this push to make dying or death considered a disease. If they can classify it as a disease, and that means it doesn't have to happen, then they can free up a lot of different grant money and monies altogether to try to fund their efforts for immortality. And so a lot of what they've been doing is trying to prove that things don't have to die. And they've done that through finding various cells that cannot be killed. And so just by doing that, they're able to say, look, there is a biological possibility here that you can not die. And so therefore give us money so that we can try to live forever. You know?
Steven just wrote, in Canada with MAID, living is almost a disease. Yeah, that's sick. That's as sick as it is true.
That's sad. Yeah.
Yeah, no, great points. And you infusing the Ananelba concept too, I find is really valuable, because people look at the Ananelba as like a kooky fringe thing that the Nazis did, and it's like, no, that's the heart and the soul of what the Nazis were up to. And if they had been successful in that gambit, then without a doubt, a lot of these seemingly kooky things that were being explored, as far as, you know, the Hollow Earth ventures and all of the other things that Himmler was overseeing, that would have been the mainstream, with ascended masters and magical beings communicating through new Templars in, you know, doing black magic and shit. That would have been the norm. And it's kind of coming back in a way that we might not recognize it, but there's, I mean, the whole UFO disclosure thing is so infused with this theosophical cosmology.
It is,
which is animating, like you said, the new archaeology, the new mainstream, you know, and so it's coming back heavy. And I love the fact that you link that together with the new Ananelba, and we should write something on that, or do like,
I agree.
That's there's something to that.
It is something, and it's wrapped up with New Age, and it's also now pushing into artificial intelligence as the new god. That's what you're watching with this Anunnaki stuff. It's sort of giving way. They're cutting off the loose and dead pieces, and they're trying to give rise to this idea of. I know the people involved too. They're just taking the money and running, and they're out there just saying this narrative, and it's all about AI being the new Christ. It's logos in silico. It's this whole, like, we're going to ascend through the machine. And it's very much, I think a lot of it's funded by Peter Thiel and people like that. So yeah.
All right, Chris, I know you've been waiting for a bit. Chris, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm here. Thanks, Matt.
Sure.
I just have a question. Could you speak a little more, Heather, about Michael Heiser's views? He seems to have come to the conclusion, like a lot of other biblical scholars, that it's much more pedestrian The Nephilim don't really translate to giants. They could translate to titans. And then is there a Collins elite? Is there a counter elite that, are working against these theories? And if you have time, I don't know if you've read Ursula Michaela Gwynn's Canopos and Argos series, but that seems to contain pretty much all the narratives that are running around the internet now. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on that. Thanks.
Yeah, I've not actually read that. I've heard of it. It's been recommended to me, and I've not taken the opportunity to read it, unfortunately. So I will make sure to do that. But Michael Heiser, he had a doctorate in Hebrew, Bible, and Semitic languages from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And so he was very much, I would say, a valuable expert in the field. But again, we just talked about how we really don't know if the Sumerian was spoken or some sort of like cipher language. So for what it's worth, but strictly on a philological level, there are a lot of things that he had a dispute with Sitchin about, specifically even Anunnaki, because Sitchin proposed it would mean those who came from heaven to earth. But in Sumerian, it would be roughly princely offspring or offspring of Anu or the noble blood. So if you think of something like coming from above down, this descendant of something that was princely, I mean, it does sound, yeah, it's like a hierarchical thing. They were also supposedly coming from the mountaintop, right? So you can see how you could construct it to be like, yeah, they came from a spaceship and all of this. So, but there are a lot of different things that he pointed out, like the Sumerian text not having listing 12 planets at all. So that was a big one that Sitchin claimed to read this tablet called the Berlin VA 243 seal. And that's a big famous one that he holds. He's actually depicted holding a giant one, which again promotes this idea of these little seals and tablets being like this big, but instead he's holding one really big. And you can find that in Google. But that one shows like a heliocentric solar system. But the dots aren't sized or spaced like planets. They're just, it's just not correct. And it was able to challenge that. And but he did a lot of things. Nibiru, that is a real word. It's a real Akkadian word, but it means a crossing over or ferry point. And it kind of talks about it being applied to celestial bodies at their crossing points. And most scholars believe, and the mathematicians as well, after they started researching how important Jupiter was to them, that it was the name of Jupiter in its like various motions. So they had a special reverence for Jupiter. So now, again, that's with an asterisk, and it could be something else, but it just shows how flimsy some of those very important things were. But then, Heiser, being sort of an evangelical, he would sometimes discuss the idea of, say, the ancient Israelite religion having like an assembly of Elohim under Yahweh, and kind of sometimes would connect them to the Anunnaki. But then where I maybe deviate from that personally is that Anunnaki is a word sort of like Baal or Lord, where there's like at least 40 Anunnaki. And then there were like the divine councils. And then there's these three, almost like a trilogy of deities that came before, like the Titans, and they are called Anunnaki. And so you have a whole family tree of these individual gods that have varying levels of importance or power. And they're all called Anunnaki, but we tend to only talk about the 12 in the pantheon, probably because of how later that was syncretized into something very familiar to us, like the Roman gods and that sort of thing. There's also something I like to point out, which are the Apkallu, and that's like what I cover in my newer book. Those are the entities that are often mistaken for Anunnaki. They have the wings and they're holding pine cones and all of this, and they are described as not being Anunnaki, but actually being associated with the Pleiadian star system and being called the Seven Sages. And they were like considered semi-biological. So they had kind of a mystical component to them. But you have this milieu of these sort of mystical creatures, and then what seem like very human type entities, then titans, then, and over the course of thousands of years, by the way, and different people coming in and changing it, but then it gets stamped with the term Anunnaki. So that makes it a little more difficult than to make those, say, Genesis 6, like Nephilim being a 1-for-1 or this. So, but that's a little bit where Heiser stood. Great work, though. I would say, definitely would recommend his work.
All right, Marty, I know you got some thoughts to share, some questions maybe. Go for it, Marty.
Appreciation more than questions. I had questions, Dr. Lynn, but you've already answered most of them. But I wanted to thank you because I've been obsessed in a negative sense with Sitchin most of my adult life. Back in my mid-20s, I spent 2.5 years as an archivist in the Jerusalem Post at the entry level before I went into the real world. And I think that if I recall correctly, and of course memory plays tricks, but I believe I met him. He was coming to Israel. It would have been 1977, 78. Just after 12th Planet came out, the money was out. He wasn't a mythical figure yet. But I remember him being introduced to me as a Jerusalem Post veteran from the 1950s and what have you. But he used the archive briefly. But the one personal thing I remember about him, I didn't have any long philosophical discussions with him or sit at his feet. I had this sense of extraordinary fraudulence. There was this little old man who was already in his late 50s or 60s. And clearly he'd been never a serious journalist, which I wasn't yet, but was beginning the road to being. But, you could tell who was and who wasn't. And he was one of these people who, self-taught, gives up themselves pretensions, a crackpot, and above all else is terrified of being found out. And that was my memory of him back then. Now, of course, very soon afterwards, he becomes, as one sees one's amazement, a god figure. But exactly. And you've done a wonderful job of deconstructing him. And I'd like to ask your assessment in a couple of related areas. Because, of course, he has this theory about the 12th planet. Am I not, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding was there has been no evidence for that so-called 12th planet on that ridiculous 3,600-year perturbing orbit. There simply is none whatsoever. Conceivably, there could be other planetary bodies operating way, way out there, far enough out in the solar system, not to have significant gravitational effects on what's further in. But the specific model that he gives, this huge planet, which also, because it was huge, could not have produced beings like Anunnaki. It doesn't make sense because I've looked into this too. If human beings could adapt to being giants, and I think just in our DNA, we adapt to different environments. But when do people grow larger, theoretically at least? If they were out in space or on the moon or maybe Mars, if the gravity was less, then over a number of generations from a previous human civilization, you could have humanoid beings, basically human as we are, but becoming much taller. But if a planet was the size of his Nibiru, the human beings would have to adapt to being dwarfs, if not ants, because the higher the gravity, the less weight. And there's a friend of mine who, again, like so many people, as you've met your share of them, Dr. Lynn, people who are geniuses in making one or two breakthroughs, but then come up with lots of other stuff, which is just wild and in every direction imaginable. And I think the book is called Cosmos and Creation or some, but the thesis was that, and to me, this is very interesting. We know it passed in the earth. We had monstrous creatures like dinosaurs, or even more recently in the Paleolithic, pre-Paleolithic eras, like gigantic mammoths. And we don't have them today. The theoretical limit today for any organic mammal on the earth is, I believe, about 20,000 pounds. And in reality, we've never had any land animal greater than 12,000 pounds. So the idea that there could be towering dinosaurs 50 feet high, like Jurassic Park, living anywhere in the world is impossible. The gravity doesn't allow it. But if the gravitation level changed, and it appears to have changed because we know in ancient times there were these colossal creatures, land creatures, 100, 150 feet in size, but it doesn't confirm Sitchin, it blows them away. because Sitchin is totally ignorant. Correct me again if I'm wrong, but my contention is Sitchin is totally ignorant of all physics, of all biology. Just he does the same thing with that as he does with his brilliant interpretation of the ancient texts. He makes it up as he went along. He simply, you see in the Ancient Aliens show, I never tire of watching this. All the cable shows say he was a great scholar. He wasn't a great scholar. Exactly. He's a self-taught fraud. And like all the best frauds, the man he first fools is himself. And he's his own main victim. And again, correct me here if I'm wrong, or confirm me if I'm right. But as far as I know, there is not a single Sumerian scholar anywhere in the world who has ever confirmed his interpretations, which supposedly he opened up to the world for the first time. And the final point I'd like you to either agree on or shoot me down on is this business of gold in the atmosphere. Now, you could make a very good theoretical case for an ancient civilizations, either human or coming from Alpha Centauri or wherever, needing gold, because gold is very hugely helpful for advanced technology. We know that it's used in the space program. It's crucial for absorbing heat, and most of all for conducting electricity. But the idea that you need gold in the atmosphere for any humanoid form that breathes any oxygen compound whatsoever, or any oxygen and other gas mix in the atmosphere, that's absolutely impossible and absurd. The idea of gold in the atmosphere is a chemical absurdity. And yet nobody takes them up on this. Instead, to my amazement, as you know, I mean, it's a new religion. And the more absurd the faith is, the more people seem to want to believe it. If you can even also, and you've talked about this very enlighteningly, bless you already, but if you can also just address this, the will to believe that it isn't even that he's a good con artist, he's a terrible con artist, but people want to be taken in by a terrible con artist. Is that a reasonable conclusion?
It's very reasonable. And in fact, I really want to hit on the gold question first, because
please,
while you are right, this is funny because you're completely correct on your assessment about like gold in the atmosphere and all of that. But I think the most important thing is to consider this almost too easy low-hanging fruit component to it, which is twofold. One, there are no Mesopotamian texts that discuss anything about gold at all. So gold isn't there.
That's wonderful.
So in the Atrahasis, this is where he pulls this from. And Atrahasis is the fullest account that opens with these junior gods that are actually doing agricultural labor for the senior Anunnaki. The specific work named is digging and dredging the irrigation canals, the Tigris and Euphrates water courses that they have there. And so they labored for, according to them, 40 years, then burned their tools and surrounded Enlil's house at night. And there was this great uproar and like a workers revolt. And that's what made Enki create the Lulu, the man from the clay mixed with the flesh and blood of a slain god, sort of like the Prometheus tale. But it's one story in that it's canal digging though, and not mining. And so the rebellion's actually over hydraulic agriculture, which has which you'd expect, given that they were in the marshes and the floodplain of a civilization whose economy ran on irrigation, agriculture, and then also temple economy upstreams, like the currents. They would use the river to go make the trade to the temples that were on the riverbeds. Now, that's just in the text itself. But the hard science answer to this is this. Southern Mesopotamia has never had gold. It is river silt. And no stone, no metal ore, and no timber. Every scrap of gold in Sumer and Akkad was imported. And that's the end of that then. So you can't even say, well, maybe they used it for this. Nope, they didn't. They couldn't have, because if the Anunnaki came to that region in particular to mine gold, and then they enslaved a species to do this work for them, well, I don't know what they were digging for a long time and found nothing. So it wouldn't have worked at all. But it's more to, I think, my personal hypothesis. I wouldn't assert it as a theory, but after working with so much of this, my personal hypothesis and some of the authors that I've found credible in this, specifically the O'Briens, they were an English couple that I mean, the guy worked for big oil from like the 20s or 30s, and he had a keen interest in this and would go and actually do excavation work on it in his spare time. And his wife helped him, and they had a side gig that I would recommend the book, The Shining Ones, The Genius of a Few. And this is just what they did, and they wrote about it. Edmund Marriage, he's passed now. He made the Golden Age Project. I think some of the literature is still available. And they argue for this almost agricultural god kind of thing. So it's, and I kind of see the text that way. I discovered their work after I came across this hypothesis of my own. And then Edmund Marriage reached out to me and said, hey, wait, you got to hear this. This is, decades of work and actual excavation to show a very similar thing. And I think he was a land manager as well, a conservationist. So he had a big interest in that. So years of looking into that, I do feel that the grand Anunnaki were not so much architects as much as they were agriculturalists. They were the gods of agriculture coming down, and then they were enslaving individuals. Indeed, that's what the texts say. But having them not mine, but dig these trenches and do this work. So that's one thing. So the gold thing, it's just impossible, because even if you wanted it to be true, they don't have gold in that region at all.
Yes.
So the fact that anybody didn't even bring that up, it's more to your point, which is that people are looking to believe. There's a quote by Nietzsche: there are two different types of people in the world, those who want to know and those who want to believe. And I think we've been given a little bit of a revelation of the method or predictive programming when it comes to the X-Files, which has that iconic poster of "I want to believe." But that's what people do. They want a belief system rather than the truth, and so they won't go that deep in it. They'll just say, "Yeah, that sounds good." It's almost like the way Greek history had been done in early Greek. It was more so like we have the historic data points, and whoever had the best story that made the most sense, that seemed good. Whereas in a Roman technique later, that would be primary source oriented, mostly data points. They kind of overcorrected there. But so when it comes to things like giants too, again, absolute scientific facts there, what you're saying, there's nothing wrong there. We would have to have a very different gravity to allow the stories that they told. Now, given that the one kind of area that I leave open is that some of these things are from oral tradition. We know most of the oldest epics are from oral tradition, and anthropologists tend to agree that oral tradition can be actually pretty important and effective, especially when it's done in an epic sense. So it's like lyric, because you can say, like, memorize a song. If I were to ask you your favorite book, and you tell me your favorite book, and I say, okay, well then start telling me the book, like from page 1, go. Less likely to be able to remember the book. But if I said to you, who's your favorite band, and then start singing me their entitled like discography, you'd probably be able to sing all the lyrics of their songs, because where that's stored in the brain is different. So early people would tend to pass their culture and stories along through song, because it would stay. And so it would be actually pretty accurate. So I do leave it open to this idea, especially in like the Gilgamesh sense, that when you have the character of Enkidu, for anyone unfamiliar, you have essentially the story of a king who was kind of a jerk, and the gods put forth this formidable creature to challenge him and befriend him, who is called Enkidu. And he's described as being somebody very hairy, living out in the forests and drinking with the gazelles. And the way they get him into the city is they send a temple prostitute out for him, seduce him. He comes in, they humanize him by giving him a shower and a shave, and then they have an adventure and a whole thing ensues. But the point of that story is simply that given that that's oral tradition, and the motif then in Mesopotamian art for a while is this of overcoming nature. So Gilgamesh dominating this animal-like creature or animal man, it kind of, to me, paints a picture of a growing people who have tension with living with different hominid species, perhaps at a very earlier date. So in like 2024, there was a paper in Nature that dated the extinction of Gigantopithecus blacki in southern China to only about like 215,000 years ago, which is a long time. But when we know, if you've been to the Smithsonian, their Hall of Evolution, there's so many skulls of different types of entities that they want to say are just basically this link where we're going to cleanly place them in this nice hierarchy, when there's too many. And we know that there's Homo erectus, there's different types of these hominids. And so perhaps some like middle Pleistocene European specimens that have been found to be really tall, not 15 feet or anything, but there were different sizes and variations. So there could have been a time at an earlier date that you might have seen a human that could have reached, say, 9 foot. So which is huge, but it does track with what the possibility would be. But that would have been so long ago, and it would have lasted only in the sort of myth and culture of a people that then shared it later. And then of course is like, if you ever go fishing, you're going to exaggerate how big the fish was. So I don't think it's impossible that some of these stories are based on some element of truth. I think there's a difference between, like, myth is true, it's just not fact. There's the facts of the matter, but mythology carries very important human universal truths and things that stand the test of time. And so it's be inaccurate to say it's not true, but it's also inaccurate to look at all of those details and say, well, it says the king lived to be 300,000 years. That must have been how long he lived. I mean, those are factual inaccuracies.
Exactly.
So how do we reinterpret what they meant by that? And that's our job to do, because they weren't writing for us. They were writing for themselves. And then you have people like Sitchin that take those numbers and they say, well, that is what it is at face value. But again, when it comes to something like Nibiru, there's no evidence for any of that in any of the texts. There's the clearest one is having to do with Jupiter, as I said, like the passing. And then there's one that I found independently that was spelled like, instead of the known Nibiru, it's spelled with an E, Nibiru. And that one I think is a contender for this thing. But what it would mean would specifically be a hot brazier that goes through the sky. And if that's
Wow.
the case, then it would just simply be, perhaps a comet. Another thing that would have been celestial in nature, still not a big planet coming to deliver us a payload of aliens. So, but there's no real evidence for that. The Akkadian word means the ferrying across. But yeah, so it's interesting. Thank you for your story about Sitchin, because it's most likely that you did indeed meet him, because your story aligns with everything I've ever heard about the man, where most people who met him in person either really had a distaste for him because he was kind of nasty to people, but if they didn't kind of kiss his ass, but he did have that almost overt con man ethos going on.
Yes.
And he surrounded himself with mostly people that were part of his little cult of personality, so as to not get called out.
If I may just first, thank you so much. That's wonderful, Doctor. And as I remember him, it would have been before he ascended. The book would have just have come out or be about to come out. So he wouldn't have been able to overcompensate for a lifetime of obscurity and being despised deservedly. So, had I met him a year or two later, no doubt I would have been crushed by him in all his own godlike
splendor.
Yes, exactly.
He was a shining one.
That fits wonderfully.
Yes. Oh, and I don't think in the earlier question that I did get to answer whether or not I think there is a Collins elite. I do want to just point out, I do think that there is, but I don't know that I think that there are a lot of these named groups. There's still Templars, there's multiple types, but whether or not they're actually still associated with the original intents of the people who created the groups is, I think, a different story. So I think that there's multiple factions calling themselves that, and sometimes these things devolve into a LARP or a live action role play.
Yes.
So.
I noticed that the person who popularized the Collins Elite was Nicholas Redfern.
Yes.
And
I know him.
Yeah. There's something a little off in how because I'm always looking for, like, okay,
clearly there are things that operate like this thing you're describing operates, but you're giving it such a characteristic that's very unique. What information are you presenting of its origins and that it is what it is? And there isn't really any foundation that I'm finding that my mind can hold on to. Kind of like the blue beam thing. And I remember we had a lecture from two fantastic researchers I've been working with, two brothers, ironically named Philip and Paul Collins. And they're really great researchers on the whole intelligence operations that have been managing the UFO Psyop for a long time. And they shared this exact same criticism, is that there's just nothing really there. So it might be almost like a synthetic construct that is potentially like a poop in the punch bowl phenomenon, where people start talking about that, or blue beam, like there are certainly, is there evidence that there are projects to use advanced technologies and holographic technologies to showcase imagery in the skies that would fold into such a psyop as like UFOs or Jesus making a comeback? Sure, absolutely. But the very terminology of blue beam per se as a project, try to find something, anything on it, and it's nothing there. It's smoke. So it's almost like these little things are done to provide a limited hangout that then invalidates the general content of the message that we're trying to communicate. That's how I'm thinking of the Collins elite, at least.
I would agree with that. And Nick Redfern, he's my view on Nick Redfern, the way that we had the same editor and publisher and connections. And I would venture to say that a lot of that type of information he got was given to him from people who are interested in putting forth a political meta narrative. He won't be writing for anymore. He actually, unfortunately, was diagnosed with dementia, early onset dementia.
Really?
I'm sorry.
Whoa.
Is very
Oh
sad.
my.
Very sad. Yeah. So he's had to move back to England, and
Okay.
yeah. So
did not know
very,
that.
very sad for him. But I don't think from what I know about him, he was he loved the topics, he loved the subject matter, and he liked to write, a prolific writer. So I would venture to say that a lot, because he would do his research by talking with people and recording the conversations, and then just dictation that way. And so this was likely information that was probably meant to get to him. You know what I mean?
That makes sense. Yeah.
Seeded.
Yep. Yeah.
Mhm.
Helly, I noticed that I didn't read your question. Did you want to pose a question? Helly, you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah, like we know a lot about the ancient Sumerians. We've discovered like Göbekli Tepe, and they're similar sites. They're way older than Sumerian, and from what I can find out, there's next to nothing except a few things on YouTube about it. I just wondered if you knew anything, and its connection to maybe what we know of the Sumerians.
Well, yes, it was billed as sort of the first temple, and a lot of that was a ploy by the archaeologists to get attention to it, because for some reason nobody wanted to give attention to the site. So he was very media savvy. That doesn't mean that there possibly weren't temple activities happening, but he kind of asserted that really big to get that attention on it. But it's older, as you mentioned, than Sumer by about 7,000 years, so it's very old. There's nothing that is known that connects them on a purely archaeological level, but its main enclosure in Göbekli Tepe is it's pre-pottery Neolithic, and so it goes back to about 12,500 years ago, which is an interesting date that's associated often with this Younger Dryas impact event. Now, whether or not that's just, people throw that around, I mean, that's very, very much could be. But I think an interesting point about Göbekli Tepe that's discussed is that at one point it was abandoned and buried over. So over time, these archaeological sites just get buried by the sands of time because of shifting but this was an intentional burial. So that makes it a little interesting. But the reliefs in it are beautifully carved with foxes, snakes, scorpions, and vultures. And they just recently found an entire room that's like a little not safe for work. It's like the phallic room, and it's just phalluses everywhere, and they don't really know why, what that is. There's erect images of like male figures and full erections, and is it a temple site? Is it a fertility thing? We just don't know yet. But they keep finding new things over and over again. They have found domestic structures, grinding equipment, and things that they now say though are still purely ceremonial, and that it doesn't indicate that anybody lived there. So they think maybe it's a settlement that just has this monumental architecture, that perhaps people were coming to it and staying for a while, like a camp out. They've seen a lot of different bones from animals that were there from far. So maybe people brought offerings. But the truth is, they just don't know. And near that whole site are other sites like it that they think are kind of connected, like Karahan Tepe is one, making big news. But it's part of what's called the Taz Tepler complex. And Göbekli Tepe was just the first one found, but it's not the only one. And it's massive. And they really do think that it's going to take decades and decades of round the clock work just to uncover about 40% of it. So it could be just absolutely monumental, no pun intended, whatever they find there. And that's why I usually try to say, with an asterisk about civilization, because we don't know. I mean, maybe we'll find a payload, maybe we'll find a tomb, maybe we'll find something there that shows more of the story. So I think that's the one to watch.
Have you found, or what is your assessment of UNESCO in the control grid over the narratives of these archaeological sites? Because I mean, I know that Julian Huxley was the founder of this thing, and when you read the famous manifesto that he wrote setting UNESCO up in '46, he's very clear that one of the mandates is to move the public mind to accept the inevitability of one world government. He also has a whole he's for UNESCO. He thinks that he somehow thought it was appropriate to spend like 5 pages saying how important the science of eugenics was as the queen of all sciences. At a really weird time in 1946 when eugenics has got a really bad name at this point. But this thing's just it's got its fingers everywhere in infiltrating the school systems, the education systems, and then co-opting and taking control of all of these international archaeology sites. And so what are your thoughts on UNESCO?
Well, you're mentioning it, and I never even stopped to consider I should probably do a whole Substack on that, because I don't think people do realize how nefarious it actually is. And it's lauded, much like the United Nations, as this like great humanitarian endeavor, and we should just, they're peacekeepers, etc. But like the United Nations, I don't have much love for UNESCO. I think the whole thing, I mean, you kind of summed it up, like how it was started, and the fact that it was kind of eugenics oriented from the very beginning. I think that sums it up right there, that this was an effort to dominate cultural property, to be able to actually dominate it on a commercial level. Also, the World Heritage Convention in like the early 70s, that one, a lot of laws came out of that. A lot of different things were politicized in archaeology after that. That kind of, on one hand, you could say was good because it gave a set of ethics and guidelines, but on the other hand, you could say was just yet another effort to centralize the whole thing in a very political way. So, but I would say, if anyone's familiar with the United Nations and some of their members, I do a lot of work researching the Lucis Trust, That was an organization. It still exists. It was once the Lucifer Publishing Company, the Lucifer Trust, and then they switched it to the Lucis Trust because, didn't sound real good to have the Lucifer Trust. But it was an organization founded by Alice Bailey, famed theosophist, and it has a correspondence school called the Arcane School. They do activities called triangles, where it's essentially a meditation group where you get together with a few other people, you make a triangle, and you're supposed to meditate together and join forces to wish, quote, goodwill for everybody and everything. Well, like UNESCO, of course, the United Nations is just a hub of theosophists, New Age thinking and globalist New World Order types. And so clearly the UNESCO is just another hive of scum and villainy. So, like, in my opinion, I mean, if I have to say what I really think, I'll tell you what I really think.
I appreciate that.
Yeah. It's off because it's part of the United Nations,
Yeah.
And I'm not a big fan of them for those reasons.
It's
but
problematic, yes.
it's very problematic.
Very cool. Another question that I had, and then I'll let you go. You've given so much of yourself, and I appreciate all of this so much. Thank you very much for doing
no,
this.
thank you. I love it.
But you brought up the original proto Noah's Ark story in as it occurred within I guess this would have been Babylon. This would have been a Babylonian proto Noah's Ark story of the
roughly like Sumer and then
Okay.
Babylon. It adopted and went through that whole area, Mesopotamia. Yep.
Okay. So in that, there's this idea that by whatever reading of the cycles of the heavens or whatever, there's an induction that, okay, something bad's going to happen, some cataclysm. Let's get ready for it. Let's look for the specialists. Let's look for the people who have technical knowledge that will be of use post cataclysm. Or interesting idea. Whether man-made or whether astrophysical, whatever, who knows? But it happens, and I'm noticing that it was reminiscent of Isaac Asimov's Foundation thesis too, right? Which is all based upon this 1,000-year dark age that the Galactic Federation is going to be put into, and the need to sort of accumulate or to set out teams to find whatever is valuable. And then you got Elon Musk naming one of his test tube baby kids Sheldon Lycurgus or something, as a little tip of the hat to the character, the psychohistory character in Foundation, which is troubling. That's a troubling decision coming from a guy with a god complex like that. But then, the influence of a lot of these sci-fi writers on shaping not just our imagination, but really potentially even shaping is kind of like new oracles, new vetted priests that would set the stage for the new myths, playing the longer game. We talked about Arthur C. Clarke. I know you've shared your interest in Arthur C. Clarke's work and role, and especially his Childhood's End. He was friends with Isaac Asimov. They were publishing in the same pulp fiction areas as L. Ron Hubbard was, as Robert Heinlein was. They're swapping wives together, like Heinlein and Hubbard are doing this weird shit. So it's like you got this like vetted nest of creatives who have been positioned to have their particular ideas of humanity infuse itself into the popular dream as kind of like shamans. And I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit more about Arthur C. Clarke, Asimov, the sci-fi realm in general, and how that fits into this this broader tapestry, this broader game.
Well, yeah, it really does too. All those connections are very real. Like the Galactic Federation, the whole like Star Trek contactee literature too starts to show up, and you can just look online and find people who claim they're part of what's called Ashtar Command. And that material comes from the 1950s. That's Billy Meyer and the Galactic Federation of Light Channelings. And then you have a recent one, Haim Eshed's 2020 claim. He's a retired Israeli space security chief who said that the U.S. and Israel were in contact with the Ashtar Command, sort of like a very much like the Galactic Federation thing. So it's like you can't escape this same story over and over again, but just in different iterations. And it's and two, the cycles of time that are kind of the older and more substantial question here. You got the Hindu yugas, like the Kali Yuga is like 432,000 years. And then the full thing, the Maha Yuga is like 4.3 million. But you have Hesiod's like 5 ages of gold through iron, Mesoamerican long count, Plato's great year. You have very similar things here, even with the kings list, the antediluvian kings and the Sumerian kings list gives us a very similar number actually of like to Kali Yuga. So it's a little interesting with the 432,000 years, or we just keep doing these sorts of things. And so it over and over again, I feel like there's some level of truth to something that people are kind of onto over time. And a lot of these individuals who are interested in trying to perhaps make a breakaway civilization or prepare for something, they're interested in all of these accounts, and they do make it out to the general public, but always in these kinds of, I guess, science fiction type things. But why it's science fiction, I don't really know why, unless that was where they felt they would be able to expand these ideas and kind of hide it under the guise of it's just a story, right? But you do see all of these connections, like you said, to like Asimov and then von Daniken, even after he had described Chariots of the Gods being inspired by Asimov's Foundation.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And so
Really?
it's not like he was like, it wasn't happening in a vacuum. You know, they're all kind of like inspired by each other. And then of course the old ones of Lovecraft, you have this idea over and over again. So I think that my feeling on it, for what it's worth, not a scientific assessment by any stretch of the imagination, but I just have a hunch that there may be some common mythos, like as they sometimes call it, the golden thread, and they're pulling at that thread and trying to figure out what it is. And perhaps there is some truth to some cataclysm that could be on the way, or even if they think there is one, and that is propelling some of their bunker building or something to that effect. Now, whether or not it's real, or I do know that some people look at it as more of a metaphysical or metaphoric thing as opposed to an actual celestial event. And so some people want to hurry up this like Kali Yuga, and maybe like as an accelerationist practice, they're like, we're going to get right to that golden age sooner rather than later. We don't want to wait anymore. Like somehow we have it within our control to do that. But it is circling the same question over and over again with this notion that we are on track to something, and it is cyclical, and we're going to face it again, and we're going to need a total reset, a great reset perhaps, that is going to require a restart of humanity altogether. And you see that in various religious texts, and also forecasted in some of these science fiction texts. So I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe there's some truth to it.
Yeah,
Start building your bunkers, getting your storable food.
Yeah, it's troubling. Yeah, they definitely like to do things in millennial cycles for some reason. They've got this fetish for that number, just 1,000, and whether it's like that weird anomaly where, like in 1077 BC, the civilizations of the world went through this weird kind of like, what the hell happened? It was
Right.
really bad everywhere, and you're wondering like, okay, it does seem like the forces of nature, independent of human action, have certain cyclical destruction or acts of destruction that punctuate the extinction cycles and things. But then again, how much of that is natural? And then human beings were a creature of ideas, including bad ideas and will. And if we get crazy ass bad ideas that become institutionalized into, a caste structure of masters and slaves, they start, how much of these cataclysms that affect negatively human lives, like the Crusades, 1,000 years, AD, which totally did damage and undid so much good that was happening before the Crusades came undone. How much of this stuff are the stars, and how much of this stuff is crazy ass ideas given way too much sway and power and influence to just throw the chessboard over periodically?
I think it's that priest class mentality that we have, this hierarchy, where I think it might be a little of both, where there are like natural events that happen. We live in a cyclical, system, and that some people may understand those patterns better than others. And then some people could understand those patterns and then use that knowledge against the people who don't. And so, for instance, in like a Mesoamerican sense, you could say they understood, the people in power understood that, we're going to have an eclipse. We know, we can predict it. We have the math, we have the understanding, but let's tell the people, hey, it's your fault, and you need to give us your firstborn children to stop this, or you can leverage that, right? And so likewise, I think in situations like climate change, we see things actually happening with climate change, but how much of it was like just the natural processes, and how much of it is now told to us that, well, it's because, you've been letting your cows burp too much, and so you deserve what you get, guys. Like, is it, how much of it is just the meddling between the leveraging of a so-called priest class against the people? So perhaps they know something's coming in a doomsday scenario. Maybe they know something's coming, but they want to try to tell us, look, it's your fault. It's we're going to need to tax you to death, and meanwhile, we'll be able to take all the wealth and the resources from you. It's like the greatest transfer of wealth ever, because we know it's all going to go down anyway. So we're just going to take what we can get.
Well, that would fit the profile of
You're right.
sociopathy. On that note, Stephen, and sorry, you just shared this thing, Stephen, last minute. I was about to close it up, but you shared this thing from the GreekReporter.com. It's a CIA declassified book, The Adam and Eve Story.
Oh, yeah.
I've heard of this. You guys heard? Yes. Have you heard of this?
Yes.
So Hapgood, as well as the maps, he also wrote Earth Shifting Crust. So there's an Earth crust displacement theory. And depending on, so this is an alternative to tectonic plate theory. And it basically says the lithosphere of the Earth is like the skin of an orange, only it can rotate over the molten inner lava. And, if you subscribe to this, and his book made some interesting arguments, the question is, how quickly does it happen? And if it happens quickly, the thinking is this could be the basis for the cyclical destruction pattern that one finds in certain mythologies and so on and so forth. So someone wrote a book, The Adam and Eve Story, which is kind of scary, to be honest. And the CIA has a classified, and according to Chan's son, they try to suppress it and then extricate some pages and all and so on and so forth. So, it gets into the CIA and remote viewing on ancient Mars and that sort of stuff. What do they know? What do they believe?
Oh, that's what that is?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
That's not the remote viewing.
And they classified this? This is a classified book?
It is, but some of it's still redacted. Like, it's on the CIA's website. It's The Adam and Eve Story, 1965, and it is about the pole shifts and the catastrophes. And he puts the cycle at like 6,500 years. And but there's a whole history there with who wrote it. They got like a Russian geologist to help with this. It was really, really interesting. But it's a very serious document. It's not very long, but it's very serious, and they kept it very serious. And I wrote about it in I can't remember which Anunnaki book, but I wrote about it because they had a commercially published book now that you can get, but it's still it's redacted in some spots.
And this is a fiction book or a nonfiction book?
This was a nonfiction book that was commissioned by people to like research this. So and it's hard to find information on the guy Chan Thomas, who like wrote it, but he used the work of this, I can't remember her name, but it was a pretty reputable and notable I think Russian geologist who it's a legit book. And you can look up, if you just Google it, you'll find it on like CIA.gov, and you can download the whole PDF. And even with the redactions that are just completely unexplained, like it's just weird. There are a couple hard copies that people claim have the unredacted, pages, but for the most part, even with the redactions, if you look at it, you can still start to see some arguments and things shape up there. But it does have to do with like those pole shifts and things regarding Greenland and Antarctica. And definitely give it a read. It's not very long, but
all right, I'm going to download it.
The last one I threw in was from someone online who I think claimed to be Chan Thomas's son. He gave me the link and said it was unredacted. So I can't guarantee it, but I just from my bookmarks. I threw it in, and maybe that's unredacted. I don't know.
Oh yeah, I got it. Okay. All right. It's in the chat for those who don't know.
In the
All
chat.
right. Thank
All
you.
right.
Thank you,
Don't
Stephen.
quote me. Okay.
All right. No. Okay. No, I appreciate that.
Thank you.
All right. Well, we've been through a buffet. I shouldn't use the word buffet. A gourmet serving of a very high quality metaphysical meal, and I really appreciate all of this, Heather, so very much. Yeah, like I said, I hope this. I don't need to encourage or say anything at this point to convince everybody to get a subscription to H Files on Substack. Some fantastic insights there on a regular basis. Heather, your books also, I'll make them, like I said, all available in the description box under this video so people can pick those up. And looking forward to future conversations and just pulling on some of these threads that you've introduced. Fantastic work. So yeah, thank you, Heather. And thank you everybody for sharing this Sunday with us. And I'll see you again next week. Bye,
Thank
y'all.
you.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone, for tuning in. I want to thank Matt, Ehret, and Dr. Lynn for a fabulous conversation here on CJ Open Mic Cast. Hopefully everyone tuned in and enjoyed it. And we'll try to do more of those, keeping up with Matt's work that he does. Great work over at the Rising Tide Foundation, as well as Matt Ehret's Substack. So I want to thank him for allowing the opportunity to simulcast a great conversation today in the Zoom meeting with the Rising Tide Foundation. So everyone stay safe, have a great Sunday afternoon, and have a wonderful evening. Thank you.